It's December 10, 2018, and it's time to review 5 of the most outrageous, infuriating, or just plain baffling things that have happened lately. It's your Facepalm 5. Let's count them down. Number 1, George H.W. Bush dies, becomes American hero. Week before last, one of the last remaining giants of the so-called greatest generation died. A veteran of the Second World War who spent his life in service to his country and community, who called on all of us to be kinder and gentler to each other, who embodied integrity and civility and quiet strength. But enough about Harry Leslie Smith. George H.W. Bush is dead too, and he was President of the United States, which, now that he's dead, means he was automatically great. Bush was a one-term Republican president who served from 1989 to 1993, the George Lazenby to Ronald Reagan's Sean Connery and Bill Clinton's Roger Moore. And before anyone says anything, yes, I know the Bond comparison is flawed because Connery came back and played Bond in Diamonds Are Forever, which was after Lazenby but before Roger Moore took over. But you know what? Sometimes the past contains complexities that don't suit our present purposes. And in such cases, we just have to ignore any inconvenient facts, make the point we wanted to make, and hope that nobody cares about the bits we left out. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, George H.W. Bush. Following his death, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, politicians and journalists, and other natural enemies laid down their arms, momentarily put aside their partisan conflicts, and came together to agree that the guy who blamed AIDS on gay people, ran one of the most infamously racist campaign ads ever, appointed Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court, and vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1990 was a really swell guy. Look, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that George H.W. Bush was the worst president ever. He wasn't. As far as Republican presidents go, he was the best one in my lifetime, and I doubt we'll see a better one from this point forward. Yes, he vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1990, but he signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. He also enacted legislation that strengthened the Clean Air Act and established new environmental regulations in the aftermath of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. He was a calm, pragmatic leader, and by most accounts, he was a nice, thoughtful guy with a sharp, often self-deprecating sense of humor. But none of that negates the lasting harm he caused by his actions, or in the case of the AIDS crisis, his inactions. From the way people from across the political spectrum have been climbing over each other to praise him, you'd think he was fit for Mount Rushmore, when he wasn't much more than an adequate president. Of course, I know what's going on here. The current president is a nightmare, and everyone is latching onto Bush as a symbol of a bygone age, when the reins of power were entrusted to better, wiser, nobler people than Donald Trump and his menagerie of malevolent monkeys. But the haze of nostalgia obscures crucial truths, including the most uncomfortable one of all for those who fetishize bipartisanship. That regardless of how effectively they were able to hide their ignorance and prejudice beneath administrative competence and personal charm, conservative presidents have almost always been enemies of progress and social justice. And while certainly above average for the category, George H.W. Bush was not an exception to that rule. He was a hell of a lot more qualified and dignified than Donald Trump, but that doesn't make him Abraham Lincoln, and we shouldn't pretend that he was. Number 2, Republicans are cheaters and sore losers. Speaking of people who are not Abraham Lincoln, week before last, the North Carolina Board of Elections refused to certify the result of the race in the state's 9th congressional district, which Republican Mark Harris won by just over 900 votes. There is now substantial evidence that the Harris campaign engaged in election fraud involving absentee ballots, which swung the result in his favor. Much of this evidence centers on Leslie McCrae Dowless, a contractor for the Harris campaign who was convicted of insurance fraud in 1992 and accused of mishandling absentee ballots in 2014. In the 9th District's Bladen County, Dowless personally turned in nearly 600 absentee ballots, many of which show signs of possible tampering. Bladen County has nearly twice as many registered Democrats as Republicans, yet Harris won the county easily, thanks in large part to a massive margin of victory in absentee ballots. The State Board of Elections is still investigating and may yet order a new election. So Republicans, who will cry election fraud all day long to justify blocking black folks from voting, may have been caught cheating to win an election, but they don't behave any better when they lose. In Wisconsin, Republicans called a special session of the state legislature to pass a series of measures limiting the powers of incoming Democrats, including new Governor Tony Evers, who defeated incumbent Scott Walker and takes office on January 7th. The new legislation imposes stricter requirements on people who receive Medicaid, reduces the number of early voting days, and limits the ability of Evers and the incoming Attorney General, also a Democrat, to withdraw from a lawsuit against the federal government over the Affordable Care Act. If all this sounds familiar, it should. These Wisconsin legislators aren't the first Republicans to react to an election defeat by cutting off incoming Democrats at the knees. Something very similar happened 2 years ago in another state. That state? North Carolina. The Republicans, a shitty party for shitty people. At least they're consistent. Number 3, Pope Francis is concerned about gay priests. With all the political turmoil taking place here in the US and across the globe, it's nice to know there are still a few respectable moral leaders left in the world. I assume. I mean, I can't think of any right this second, but there must be some somewhere, right? And I was just saying that it's nice to know that. Anyway, this story is about the Pope. In a recently published interview, Pope Francis says he is worried about homosexuality among priests, calling it a very serious question and warning that homosexuality has become fashionable in society, which could have a negative influence on the church. Yes, wouldn't it be a shame if society's growing tolerance and acceptance of gay people had an influence on one of the world's most powerful religious institutions? Anyway, that's not all he said. Francis adds that there is no place in priestly life for homosexual affection and says, for this reason, the Church urges that persons with this rooted tendency not be accepted into priestly ministry or consecrated life. He also says that gay priests currently in the Church should remain celibate and consider leaving the priesthood. Now, it just so happens I am not gay, therefore it's not my place to speak on behalf of the gay community, so please keep in mind that I speak only for myself when I say to Pope Francis, fuck you! You're so worried about how fashionable homosexuality is becoming, well, maybe you should take this opportunity to bring your own understanding of the subject more in line with the times. If celibacy is a requirement for all priests, why do you admonish gay priests in particular to remain celibate? Do you think that gay people have a harder time keeping it in their pants than hetero people? And that line of yours that I quoted a minute ago, where you refer to being gay as a rooted tendency, that seems to suggest that you accept that a person's sexual orientation is not the result of a conscious choice. And if that is the case, how do you justify discriminating against anyone on the basis of their sexual orientation at all? And in conclusion, if I were gay and a priest, I probably wouldn't take too kindly to being lectured about sexual morality and told that I need to leave the priesthood by the leader of a church that has spent centuries covering for priests who rape children. Okay, I'm done. You can go. No, not the rest of you. Just the Pope. Everyone else can stay. Number 4, ICE fails to release report on trans woman who died in custody. Back in May, Roxana Hernandez Rodriguez, a 33-year-old trans woman from Honduras, died in New Mexico while in the custody of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. An autopsy concluded that Hernandez Rodriguez had died from complications of dehydration, from which she apparently suffered for several days without receiving treatment. Week before last, the Daily Beast published the results of a second autopsy ordered by the Transgender Law Center, which also found evidence that Hernandez Rodriguez had been physically abused while in custody, including deep bruising on her hands and abdomen and indications of blunt force trauma. Making matters worse, ICE has still not released an official report on the death of Hernandez Rodriguez, which is required by law within 60 days of a death in custody. ICE did publish a press release announcing Hernandez Rodriguez's death the day she died, but no final report detailing the circumstances of her death has yet been released. A spokesperson for ICE told a reporter for the website Into that an investigation is ongoing, and when it's completed, that report will be available through Freedom of Information Act request. But given the generally shitty track record of ICE and the flagrantly anti-trans attitude of the Trump administration, I wouldn't hold my breath. Speaking of the transphobe in chief, it's now time for the segment devoted to some of the other things Donald Trump has done recently to disgrace the presidency and embarrass and/or endanger the United States and the rest of the world. It's number 5, the further misadventures of Lord Dampnut. Please keep in mind, as always, the following is not a complete list. He said he doesn't believe his own administration's report on the dangers of climate change, explaining that he has very high levels of intelligence, that our air and water right now are at record clean, and as to whether or not it's caused by human activities or will have devastating effects, I don't see it. Because you didn't read the report, you fucking shithead! It's in the report! He was also the only world leader who attended the G20 summit in Buenos Aires not to sign a statement reaffirming a commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement, which Trump has announced the U.S. will withdraw from. After General Motors announced it was cutting 14,000 jobs in anticipation of an economic downturn caused by Trump's tariffs, Trump blamed GM and threatened to cut the government subsidies the company receives. A week later, he tweeted, "I am a tariff man," and went on to demonstrate that he has no idea how tariffs work or who ends up paying for them. He used an 8-vehicle motorcade to visit former President George W. Bush, who was in Washington, D.C. for his father's funeral and staying at a guest residence 250 yards from the White House. Here are some photos of past presidents walking there, just to prove it can and has been done. He attended the funeral of George H.W. Bush at the National Cathedral, where he sat, arms folded petulantly, listening while one eulogist after another described, indirectly but in detail, why Bush was a way better president than he was. He responded to his former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson describing him as an undisciplined person who doesn't like to read and constantly tries to do illegal things by tweeting, "Tillerson was dumb as a rock, and I couldn't get rid of him fast enough. He was lazy as hell. He might not be very articulate, but he sure can project." And finally, Trump reacted to the release of a series of sentencing memos submitted by special counsel Robert Mueller by having another extended Twitter meltdown, tweeting, "Without the phony Russia witch hunt, my approval rating would be at 75%. It's called presidential harassment. Will Robert Mueller's big-time conflicts of interest be listed at the top of his Republicans-only report? Will all of the substantial and many contributions made by the 17 angry Democrats to the campaign of crooked Hillary be listed in top of report?" And most bewilderingly of all, apparently in response to the sentencing memos, which seem to imply that Trump is guilty of collusion among other crimes, totally clears the president. Thank you. The day before that, probably in response to something about the Mueller investigation, but who the hell even knows, he tweeted, "Fake news, enemy of the people." At the very moment he posted the tweet, the New York offices of CNN were being evacuated following a bomb threat, which turned out to be fake, thankfully. That is but the latest of many incidents of violence or threatened violence against the media. Trump continues to vilify and incite violence against the media because journalists who report the truth are a threat to his power. For all our sakes, I hope that threat turns out to be genuine. That's 5. Speak out, act out, resist, look after each other. Hey folks, hope you got something out of this one. If you did, please click like and share and subscribe to the channel if you're not subbed already. And also, please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by becoming a supporter of this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of this channel for as little as $1 a month. But if you pledge $5 a month or more, you get yourself a shout out at the end of the Facepalm 5, just like these, my newest $5 or more per month patrons. Kenneth Carlson, thank you, Kenneth. R. Kincaid Stevenson, thank you, R. Kincaid. Chris McBride, thank you, Chris. Martin Pakes, thank you, Martin. Eric Hancock, thank you, Eric. Dr. Babylon, thank you, Dr. Babylon. And Chris Cheetah, thank you, Chris Cheetah. Thanks to all of my patrons, however long you've been a supporter and at whatever level you are currently supporting. Thanks to all of you for watching, whether you're patrons or not. I appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.